All right, y'all, you're locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are breaking down the near comeback for the Falcons in their 31-27 week 2 loss to the Rams. And we'll also be talking about if it's time to turn the page on the Marcus Mariota era.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast. You may know me by my other names, such as Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka your very humble podcast host of this Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is presented by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Pick projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. So, jumping right into today's conversation, which we thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and YouTube. Of course, if you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. But the Falcons were able to come back in this game after a very rough first 3 quarters. It was kind of the exact opposite of what we saw in week 1 against the Saints, where the Falcons, outplayed the Saints in the first 3 quarters and then blew it 16-point lead in the fourth quarter. And in this game against the Rams, the Falcons were thoroughly outplayed by the Rams in the first 3 quarters and then kind of made a valiant effort to come back. Were not quite able to overcome that 21-point deficit that they had with 12 minutes left. They were up 16 last week with a little bit more than 12 minutes left in that game. And you just sort of see a tale of 2 stories, right, for the Falcons, right? The Rams dominated the first 3 quarters. You look at some of the stats, the Rams had like 51 plays, 324 yards in the first 3 quarters, going up to that, in the beginning of the fourth quarter as well, up to the point when they were up 31-10. They were averaging about 6 yards per play. They were 4 for 5 in the red zone. They were 5 for 6 on third downs. You compare that to the Falcons in the first 3 quarters. They had 42 plays, 182 yards, only averaging about 4 yards per play. They had a turnover. They were 1 for 3 in the red zone, 3 for 8 on third downs. And then you look at that point, once the Rams went up 31-10, it completely changed. And the Rams had 12 plays, 13 yards, only 1 yard per play from that point on. They turned the ball over twice. They were 1 for 4 on third downs. Then the Falcons had 14 plays, in those final 12 minutes, had 79 yards, were averaging 5.6 yards per play. They did turn the ball over once. They were 1 for 1 in the red zone, and they were 0 for 2 in third downs. And that probably, being unable to convert a couple of those third downs, might have been the difference between the Falcons winning and losing this game, or at least making a little bit more interested. But it went down to the closing seconds of this football game. So where did it all begin with this comeback, right? The Rams go up 31-10. It's 12 minutes left in the game. The Falcons get an explosive play to Drake London on that ensuing drive. Then they get another semi-explosive play, an 18-yarder to Kadarius Hodge that puts them in the red zone. And then they eventually find Olamide Zaccheaus who looked like it was a busted coverage because he was basically wide open in the flat on an 11-yard touchdown. That cuts the Rams lead to 31-17 with 8 minutes to go. And then the Rams are kind of running out the clock. They're kind of milking the clock. And the Falcons' run defense sort of clamps down on it. And then special teams, it matters. They show up on that ensuing drive. Troy Anderson comes up the middle on fourth down to block the punt. Lorenzo Carter scoops it up, runs it 26 yards for a touchdown. The Falcons go for 2, now down, a score. And Mariota on a sprint out hits Drake London, and that cuts the Rams lead to 31-25 with 5 minutes left to go. And, if you were questioning the Falcons' ability to come back, you weren't questioning anymore. And I was out there on Twitter being like, they're going to come back. They're going to come back. Because I just had this gut feeling that, the Falcons are going to basically have this type of season where they're going to play one way for the first 3 quarters and then completely the opposite way in the fourth quarter. And then the Rams are still running out the clock. It sets up a 3rd and 4. And then Cooper Kupp beats Darren Hall on a slant, but Hall does not give up on the play. He punches the ball out from behind on Cooper Kupp. It sort of bounces around, squirts through a couple of people's legs, and then Darren Hall himself winds up recovering the football, giving the Falcons the ball at the Rams 37-yard line. You get 2 catches from Drake London. That puts him in the red zone with about 2 minutes left in the game. Then the Falcons run a read option play. Mariota's keeps it. He's tackled for a 4-yard loss. And then on a 3rd and 13, it's 4 down territory. So the Falcons seemingly don't need to get it all in this situation. But now finally Aaron Donald, after having a relatively quiet game, makes his presence known for really the first and final time in this game, gets pressure up the middle, pressure in Mariota's face. He heaves it up. It's sort of a jump ball to Bryan Edwards along the goal line, going for it all in this play. And Bryan Edwards is beat at the catch point by Jalen Ramsey, picks it off at the goal line. The Rams get the ball back with basically a minute left at their own 23. They run it 3 times. They force the Falcons to utilize their final 2 timeouts. They get the clock down to 13 seconds for a 4th and 7. And the notable thing here was that on that previous block punt by Troy Anderson, he ran into the punter, right? And it's not a penalty because if you block the punt, you're good. And the punter got injured. Looked like Riley Dixon sort of hyperextended his knee on that play. So the Rams, instead of punting it, they put Brandon Powell, former Falcons legend, in the game to sort of take the punt back. And rather than punting it, he just runs it out the back of the end zone for his safety with 6 seconds left on the clock. And so the Rams are now leading 31-27. And then Dixon's out there for the free kick on the ensuing kickoff, and the ball goes out of bounds. It gets a good bounce for the Falcons. So the Falcons take over at 50-yard line. So they got 6 seconds. They got 1 shot, a Hail Mary. Maybe they can pull off the miracle. And the Rams only rushed 3 guys, and they still managed to get Mariota sacked on the final play. And so that ends the game. It was kind of a lackluster performance for Mariota. That sort of play, kind of signal things there. And it kind of leads us into the conversation that we're going to get into to continue today's sort of rapid reaction episode. Is there a quarterback change imminent? Right? Is that quarterback change potentially to Desmond Ridder going to happen a lot sooner than we think because of Mariota's lackluster performance in these first 2 games of the season? And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode, guys. But before we get there, I do want to tell you about Prize Picks, a fun new way to play daily fantasy. Prize Picks is safe, it's fast, it's easy. All you got to do is pick 2 to 5 players, and if they're going to score more or less than their Prize Picks projections. This past week, I think I don't even remember my picks, but I think I had Cooper Kupp going over 100 yards, which I think he did. And I can't remember my other pick for this game. I think I had somebody, I can't remember, but all you got to do is go to prizepicks.com. You can actually remember your picks, guys, by going to prizepicks.com, playing the fun way of playing daily fantasy sports, whether it's NFL, MLB, NHL, NBA, all that, college football, more. You just go to prizepicks.com, and the first time users will get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That means if you deposit $100, you'll get $100 in free money from Prize Picks to play with. Don't forget to use that promo code Locked On to sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. So let's continue today's rapid reaction, talking a little bit more about, whether or not, Mariota is no longer long for this world as the Falcons starter. And this was a question that my good buddy Jarvis Davis raised on the Locked On Falcons postcast, which you can find on the Locked On Sports Atlanta YouTube page live after the game. I'm sure if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, it's also on the Locked On Falcons feed, the audio version of that episode. But Jarvis and I talked about this, and I think it's definitely a fair question, right? I'm, as I said last week after the week 1 game, I'm not going to be overly judgmental on Mariota because I do think he is working off 2 years of rust. But next week, it's going to be harder to be to give Mariota the benefit of the doubt because the Falcons have a very, very winnable game against the Seahawks on the road. And I think if Mariota does not get the job done there and get the Falcons their first win of the season, you start out the season obviously 0-3. You're looking at, tougher matchups against Cleveland and Tampa Bay and, Cincinnati and San Francisco. Although, again, I know that none of those teams quite look like the juggernauts that I think a lot of people thought some of those teams would be. Maybe not Cleveland, but other teams in that list would be. But you do wonder if, I think it's certainly fair to wonder if a switch to Desmond Ridder might be coming a lot sooner than we thought. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for the last several months since we selected Desmond Ridder, since the schedule came out in mid-May, I've been sort of circling that week 8 matchup at home against the Carolina Panthers as the prime opportunity to throw Desmond Ridder out there and see what you have for the remainder of the season, much to the chagrin of very many people, and sort of thinking, okay, yeah, you give Mariota about 6 or 7 starts, and that should be more than enough for you to evaluate your weapons and your offense and your running game and all the other things that you need to find out about this team before you sort of quote unquote give up on the season and throw the young guy out there to the wolves. And that's led to me calling Marcus Mariota a bridge quarterback, again, much to the chagrin of some of those Mariota stands out there in the audience. And now we're at a point where it's not just me talking about Mariota being this bridge quarterback, which again, to me, should not be a surprise to anybody out there. I'm not going to sit here and say I told you so, but I am petty and I do keep receipts. So, maybe some of you guys might be hearing from me in the future, but I certainly think it is a fair question to ask, and we'll see what Arthur Smith has to say. Haven't heard his post-game press conference in that regard. I'm sure someone asked him about that question. And if they didn't, on Sunday, then I'm sure on Monday and later this week, he will certainly get asked that question. My guess, knowing Arthur Smith as well as I know him, and I know he listens to this podcast on a daily basis, so he knows me very well as well. I would assume that he's not going to be quick to pull the trigger on Desmond Ridder, inserting him into the lineup. And personally, I get it. Like, I'm not really in any rush to throw Ridder out there next week or whatever. I'm willing to give it some time. I'll just let the people decide. Look, I'm not going to be out in front of the Desmond Ridder hype train. Quite like I'll let the people decide. If the people decide that they want to see Desmond Ridder, then I'll be like, oh, okay. Like, I wonder who possibly could have been, talking about this in August. But, I don't know. But, if you, the people in the Bane voice, let the people decide, like I'll let you guys decide if you want Ridder to be out there. But, it looked like a pretty rough performance. Again, we'll see what the film says, as I say every time on these rapid reactions. But Mariota did throw 2 picks in this game, although one of them was on Cordero Patterson, and the ball sort of tipped off his hands into the waiting arms of the defender. But the second one, it did feel like Mariota did get greedy on that 3rd and 13 at the end of the game where he didn't need to. And again, we'll see what the film says, but your veteran quarterback in both of the first 2 games has not done a good job protecting the football as well as you hope. That's the whole point of having the veteran quarterback. He's going to do a better job of doing that. And that's one of the bigger deterrents of playing Desmond Ridder, a young quarterback who's, as we saw in the preseason, was not necessarily the guy that was doing a great job protecting the football himself, although a lot of that was due to him getting a lot of pressure. And the concern we had, at least the concern I had going in to the season, was throwing him behind this bad offensive line would lead to some, potentially bad elements. But the offensive line has not been the liability that we, and by we, I mean me, thought it would be going into the season, right? They did give up 3 sacks today. But and we did see some concerns where they gave up a lot of pressure when they were going to their 5-man protections, so that is going to be a concern if they get into the straight drop back passing game. But even when the Rams got up big in this game, you thought, oh, this is going to be open season on the Falcons quarterback. It really wasn't. Like there were 6 quarterback hits allowed in this game, but for the Falcons, that's a low number, right? That's an average number of hits in an NFL game, by the way. It's about 6 or 7 hits per game. And so, given, that only one of those came from Aaron Donald, I think 0 sacks came from Aaron Donald, that says something, right? You're also showing that your running game has been competent so far through the first 2 games of the season, right? They weren't good enough today to carry the offense like they were in week 1 against the Saints, but it was decent enough, right? If you look at Algier and Patterson kind of split carries, they both got 10 carries today. Their combined success rates was about 50% rushing the football, particularly I think on first down in this game. No, it was actually 54% success rate rushing on first down in this game for the Falcons. And so, like, that's good enough to keep this. That's a good number, by the way, for those of you not familiar with success rate. Anything above 45% is good, right? And anything above 50% is very good. So that's a good number to hit in order to keep your offense on schedule, particularly if you're going to have a young quarterback in the lineup and protect him and not put him into detrimental situations. If the Falcons can run that effectively against the Saints, who were, according to Football Outsiders, the #1 run defense in the league last year, against the Rams, who were top 5 in the league both of the last 2 years in terms of run defense, according to Football Outsiders, and they're able to find that level of success against, 2 of the better run defenses in the league, that bodes well for this offense moving forward. So this running game is far outperforming certainly my expectations. And so while I won't sit here and say, putting Ridder in there is going to save your season, although I wouldn't quite put it past him, we'll see what happens. I'm hopeful. But I think the voices and the calls for Ridder to get on the field sooner versus later are only going to get louder from this point in time, especially if the Falcons cannot find a way, or Mariota cannot find a way to come out of Seattle next week to wrap up this West Coast trip with a win, right? Like, the reason why I don't know if you're going to start Ridder next week, because, Seattle is not a great team, but it's a hostile environment. You're on the West Coast, are the Falcons going to stay out on the West Coast this week, or are they going to travel back to Atlanta? I don't know if I don't know if you want to rush Ridder this week, but I think you give Mariota, third time's a charm, see if he can get this team into the win column next week. And if he can't, then I think you're really starting to have a conversation, a much louder conversation about getting Ridder that start in week 4 at home against the Browns, another winnable game going in that we all thought going into the season. And the whole point of starting Mariota this season was, at least for me, was because he was going to be the sacrificial lamb, because the Wolves were going to come for him, like Aaron Donald and all those guys. And so far, the Wolves haven't been circling, right, like we thought they would. Or, when I say we, me, right? Like, so, my hope is for Mariota's sake, for the Mariota stands out there that are still, hopeful that he's going to get this team back to the postseason. I'm very curious to hear from you guys in the comments where you at. But hopefully he can get bounce back next week for him. Obviously, I know there's going to be a vocal section of Falcon fans that are going to be Team Ridder, that are going to be like, no, let's get Ridder out there as soon as possible. Why are we delaying the inevitable? And I understand that sentiment, but again, I'll let the people decide on that. If you guys want to push that agenda, then I'll just take a back seat to that and just be like, who possibly could have been talking about that in August and whatnot. But we'll do an investigation here on Locked On Falcons to find out if anybody was talking about that back during the summer. So I'll keep you locked on that as the rest of the week goes. But the rest of today's episode, we'll talk about sort of what didn't and did not work with the Falcons game plan and why they fell into that big hole, through the first 3 quarters. And talk about some of the bright spots despite all that disappointment in those first 3 quarters, particularly in the fourth quarter. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's episode. But guys, I want to tell you about the world's largest car sharing marketplace. That is, of course, Turo. You can book any car you want, wherever you want. From a community of local hosts, you can browse a huge selection of vehicles for whatever your occasion is, whatever your budget is across the US, Canada, and the UK. If you want to book a spacious SUV or minivan for that upcoming family road trip, you can do that. If you want to get a classic luxury car for that special event or birthday or upcoming holiday, you can do that. If you just need an affordable economy car that can get you from A to B that fits within your budget, you can do that as well. Or, hey, test drive that new electric vehicle that you've had your eye on and you're just wondering, hey, could I be this new age person that drives, an electric car or whatever? You can do that with Turo. All you got to do is head to the website. Many Turo hosts will even deliver the car directly to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Ditch the boring rental cars by heading over to Turo.com. That's Turo.com. So we're wrapping up today's episode, guys, but I want to thank you again for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. And of course, make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Hit that bell, give us a like as well. And of course, subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube as well, so that you can get that, live, hit that bell, give us a like, get that live notification for when we do the Locked On Falcons postcast, as well as the Locked On Braves postcast. And of course, the 3 daily shows every single day on Locked On Sports Atlanta. ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and TD Batiste, A to Z with Mark Zeno, and Hitting Hard with John Chuckery. So, we're trying to get over 3,000 subscribers here on Locked On Falcons. So help a brother out and hit that subscribe button here on Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. But let's wrap up today's episode talking about, sort of why things did not go the way that the Falcons wanted it to go in the first 3 quarters. And going into this game, if you guys were listening to, Thursday and Friday's episodes when we did the crossover with Locked On Rams, and of course the Friday preview with Jarvis Davis, this was a bad matchup for the Falcons, right? We kind of knew their game plan was going to be, let's run the ball on offense, and let's hope that can keep the Rams front and pass rush at bay. And part of the reason why I was down on this team going into this game was watching the film from the week 1 game. I didn't think the offensive line did as much to control the line of scrimmage as the box score indicated. As I said last week, it felt like that was mostly Cordero Patterson having a great day rushing rather than the offensive line, and going up against a really good defensive line for the second week in a row. Again, they checked that box in week 1, but I didn't think it was a great matchup for them going up against Aaron Donald in week 2. But again, there were positive things to see from this game. 90 yards rushing, certainly more than I probably thought. If you had asked me going into this game how many yards rushing this team is going to have, I probably would have said under 60. So they were able to exceed that. And as I said earlier, they were pretty effective on early downs running the football. The problem was that despite that going generally in the direction of the Falcons for most of the game, there wasn't much else to build on that. The timing, the rhythm, the precision in the passing game just wasn't there. We talked about that in week 1. Didn't look like to be there in week 2. Again, we'll sort of, won't make final judgments until we watch the film on Tuesday, and then break that down on Wednesday's Q&A and all 22 review. But it didn't look good upon initial watch of this game. The other thing on the offensive line was, it wasn't really Aaron Donald that was creating all the problems for him. At least watching the game live, we'll see what the rewatch says. But watching the game live, it seemed like Greg Gaines, particularly in the one-on-ones he had against Drew Dahlman, really gave the Falcons problems. Like that's the Aaron Donald effect, right? He's going to absorb all the double teams, and it's going to leave you one-on-one with Leonard Floyd and Greg Gaines and Justin Hollins. And it seemed like Greg Gaines was the guy that stepped up in a major way to take advantage of those one-on-ones more so than the other guys. There were also some low snaps, a number of them from Drew Dahlman. That was an issue that he had going back to his days at Stanford. So, this game, we talked about Drew Dahlman on the All 22 review last week being like, hey, he was solid. He wasn't amazing, but he was solid. It was a good start for him. Seems like taking that step back on today. So Dahlman Hive took a hit today upon initial watch, but one of the positive things for the Falcons passing attack was Drake London's performance. Again, another great week in a row. If you missed Friday's episode, we talked about Drake London. That was a listener question. What do we think of Drake London's debut? Both Jarvis and I expressed how, impressive Drake London was in that week 1 game, given, that he basically hadn't played in 3 weeks, and going up against Marshawn Lattimore, a guy that routinely, locks down sort of big physical receivers like that. Drake London had another great day again, 8 catches, 86 yards and a touchdown today. Cordero Hodge was sort of the Falcons' number 2 receiver in this game, and we've seen quite a bit of Cordero Hodge, Cordero Hodge so far this season. A lot more of him than I think probably a lot of people expected to see, certainly the Auden Tate fans in the audience. But Hodge had 2 catches for 57 yards, including a 39-yarder, only 3 targets for Kyle Pitts, right? 2 catches, 2 targets, 1 catch for Brian Edwards. And that's a little underwhelming, a lot underwhelming. We know that the Rams tend to play a lot of zone. We'll see what if they switch things up this week on film, but that's usually their MO. And it's notable to me because, like, when you go back to Pitts' big games last year, most of it came in games against teams that played a lot of man coverage, right? The Jets game, the Dolphins game, he was cooking man coverage. I remember having that conversation midway through last season where Pitts was like the highest graded player according to Pro Football Focus's stuff against man coverage, after that coming out of the Dolphins game. And we haven't seen, teams have been able to seemingly take him away by playing a lot of zone. And that's, that's problematic, right? Again, we'll see sort of, we'll hold, official opinion until we watch the film. But, it's a little disappointing start for Kyle Pitts. Defensively, the Falcons, weren't having a great matchup. They weren't able to get enough pressure. They weren't doing a good enough job tackling. Michael Walker did have a great interception in this game, an outstanding play for him, sort of dropping back into the zone to snag Matthew Stafford there. Of course, I confuse Matthew Stafford throwing picks with Marcus Mariota throwing picks. How could I possibly do that? But, there were some missed tackles from Michael Walker. That was an issue that he had last year, having some opportunities to make some open field tackles. It didn't quite take advantage of that. And, the thing that also stood out to me in this Falcons game plan was they played a lot of big nickel, right? And it was notable because I thought, we would see potentially a lot of D. Alford, Mike Ford. That would be an interesting matchup against Cooper Kupp. We saw a lot of Eric Harris against that. And hey, look, I get the Falcons wanting to play big nickel against the Rams. They play a lot of 11 personnel, but they run a lot out of the 11 personnel. And you want to have that more physical presence against the run by playing that big nickel, by having that third safety on the field rather than the three corners on the field. But at least from my standpoint, if you're going to employ that strategy, which I don't have a problem with, to me, it makes more sense to put Richie Grant in the slot, where he's just better at that. Then you probably put Hawkins back deep, and then you have Eric Harris more in that underneath run thumper role that Hawkins tends to play. And so, I think that's a question mark for the Falcons moving forward. But again, Dean Pease loves him some Eric Harris. So we'll see what the film says on that. But, we knew going into this game, the Falcons were going to play some zone. And that means two things have to happen if you're going to rely on your zone coverage. You got to get pressure with four guys, and you got to tackle. And the Falcons did not get reliable pressure with four guys. They did not tackle well in this game. They had one sack, two quarterback hits. The one sack was basically Stafford scrambling and Ogundeji tackling him at the line of scrimmage. Taquan Graham had both of the quarterback hits. The Falcons did not take advantage of the weakened Rams offensive line, which only got weaker in this game because the replacement started at right guard. Tremaine Ingram, I think, got hurt on like the second play of the game. And his replacement, Alaris Jackson, seemingly, had no problems. Again, we'll see what the film says when it comes from that. But, my expectation kind of going into this game was the Falcons would come back down to earth a little bit this week after a really strong start to their season in week one. And, a lot of that was due to my expectation. I just didn't think it was a great matchup for the Falcons, right? I wasn't high on the Falcons going into this week because I thought their game plan was going to rely on their ability to control the line of scrimmage, if not control the line of scrimmage, but frankly, dominate the line of scrimmage in order for them to win a game. And anytime their game plan centers on that, I'm going to be skeptical, as I have been skeptical about those areas of their roster for the entire offseason. However, I will give the Falcons this amount of credit. We talked about this during the summer. Pro Football Focus ranked their offensive line 28th out of 32 teams going into the season. They ranked their defensive line 32nd out of 32 defensive lines going into the season. And part of the reason why I was so skeptical and negative and pessimistic about the Falcons this season, because it's like, hey, they're going to have a bottom 5 unit in the trenches. And I feel like they've exceeded those expectations. Again, maybe they're closer to league average in both of those areas based off of what we've seen. Again, not great in those areas, but like good enough to keep them competitive against some teams that are known for being really strong in those areas, with the Rams and the Saints, particularly on the defensive line. It wasn't the domination that we were so accustomed to seeing last year, even against lesser defensive lines. Like the Giants last year, like kicked our butt in that game. And it was just like, come on, man, like, what are we doing? So I got to give the Falcons that amount of credit. Again, I thought they were going to be bottom 5 trench team, bottom 3 trench team. And they're may be bottom 12th worst or 15th worst or somewhere in that, closer to the middle of the pack. Again, we'll see how it all shakes out as the rest of the season goes. But I think because of that reason, it goes back to the conversation with Desmond Ridder, because you don't feel like there's a massive liability in the trenches. And if the Falcons can rely on their trench play to be decent for the remainder of the season, And, throwing Ridder out there, is not like throwing them to the wolves. Like, and if he is being thrown to the wolves, he's got a very big stick out there with him to continue the metaphor. So we'll see again what the Falcons do against the Seahawks. I expect Mariota to continue to get the start. But again, if the Falcons cannot step up, if he cannot bounce back and help himself, buy himself more time with a win, as I've said all summer long, Mariota's time, not on this earth, but as a starter for the Falcons is based off of their ability to win football games. At least that's how it works in the NFL. I don't think it's going to be any different here in Atlanta. But we'll just sort of see how that goes next week. But we'll end things on a positive note. Did see some young guys stepping up, right? Jaron Hall made some plays. Troy Anderson made some plays. Michael Walker made some plays. Drake London, Tyler Algier. I didn't have the highest hopes for this season. I just kind of wanted a fun, entertaining team. And we saw that in the fourth quarter, right? I want to see those flashes of these young guys so that we can get excited about the future of this rebuild. Because again, unlike a lot of other people, this team to me has been a rebuilding team. I didn't have these, 8, 9, 10 win expectations that I know some of you very vocal Falcon fans out there have been having for this team going into the season. But, even without the fourth quarter comeback, I don't think I probably would have been mad from this game. That's the beauty of having low expectations. Basically all I ask for is, hey, just be a fun 5-12 team, right? And if you're better than that, look, I'll take that too. Although, that will ruin my Will Anderson and Jalen Carter dreams, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But basically like Falcons are just going to, I've heard someone else say this, if they're going to be this year's Lions team, which is a fun, scrappy team that just, doesn't win a ton of games, but is in every game, I'll take that. I'll take that all day, every day, guys. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'll take that any day of the week. So, from my perspective, we might be having a little bit more fun and this team might be a little bit scrappier, if the Ridder era gets started, sooner versus later, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And that will do it for us here on today's episode, guys. Really appreciate you joining me on today's episode. We will call it a day, an evening. And of course, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Why not check out the Peacock and Williamson podcast as your second listen, as Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson are giving you the lowdown on all the things that happen with the other 31 teams on Sunday. So check out Peacock and Williamson on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Guys, really appreciate it. We'll be back later this week. Break down the film. If you want me to focus on something when I get to the film on Tuesday, by all means, hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And if you haven't learned, we do have a Discord now. The link is in the description, the Locked On Falcons Discord. And of course, you can submit your questions there as well. So guys, really appreciate it. Till then.